Welcome to the Profile Corner. Today's video is going to start a video series on creating mortise and tenon joints using a variety of different tools. Today's video will use somewhat primitive tools or tools that you might have on a very limited budget. For example, I have a partially complete set of porta-cable drill bits. These are probably about 23 years old or so, maybe even 25 years old. Some of these are still sharp, so that'll be a benefit for us. We'll be using a 3/8" drill that I bought new in 1985, a mallet, a doweling jig. This is a Dowl-It 1000. This is made in the United States. It sells new for about $70. I bought this one new a year ago. I still haven't used it yet. It's still sealed in the package. You can buy a similar Dowl-It 1000 doweling jig on eBay right now for somewhere between $20 and $30. So these are reasonably priced and they're made in the United States. There's a lot of cheaper ones on the market on Amazon. You probably want to go with a good quality one like this one. If you do get a doweling jig, we'll be using a cheap set of Dewalt chisels that I paid, I believe it was about $22 for, a set of 3. These are freshly sharpened, so that'll help us out. I have a mechanical pencil, an old ruler. This is one that I picked up at an auction. The numbers are a little bit hard to read, but I believe this is an accurate ruler, so that's important. This is a set of rulers that I picked up on Amazon probably 2 years ago. It's a Violet Fox brand. You've got to watch out. Not all rulers are accurate. As a matter of fact, the 8" ruler here is not consistent with the 12" ruler around the 7 and 8" inch mark. So you've got to be careful what kind of ruler you use. Also, these rulers are somewhat thick, and so that could introduce a parallax error. In other words, if you're not looking straight down at the ruler, you could be measuring incorrectly. And that's one of the benefits of this steel ruler, is that it's very thin, so you don't have much chance for a parallax error. Okay, in addition to these tools, I'll be using a 10" Delta contractor saw that I bought roughly 35 years ago. And this is probably a 40-year-old saw. We'll be using a single blade on the saw. It's designed for both cross cuts and rip cuts. And I'll show you when we get over to the saw one type of saw blade that you could have on the saw that would make the cut a little bit nicer looking, so we don't have to do quite as much cleanup work. We have a board here that'll serve as a leg, and this board is 1 7/8" square. This is a red oak board. And then we have another board here that's also red oak. This is 3/4 inch thick and 4 inches wide. And we're going to join these using a mortise and tenon like this, except that this board will actually be going inside the thicker board by about 3/4 inch. So roughly around there. And so we'll get started making this joint here in just a moment. We'll get started first by making the mortise, and then we'll cut the tenon that mates up with the mortise so that it's exactly the right size to fit into the mortise. So I've got to get this doweling jig unwrapped, and then we'll get started. And at the end of this video, just for a treat, I'll recreate this joint on the PantoRouter, and we'll see how easy it is to produce on the PantoRouter if you've got not just limited tools, but you've got essentially the tools that make the job the easiest to complete. Yeah, I added a couple additional tools on the workbench here. I need a couple of clamps to be able to hold the board down to the workbench. So I've got a couple 12-inch clamps, and I also have a speed square that I picked up secondhand. So we'll be using that, and also some blue tape. You could use masking tape if you've got that. I don't have any masking tape on hand, so I'll be using the blue tape. Here's the layout of the mortise that we'll be cutting. I've got it so that it's going to be a 1/2 inch wide, which is going to give a lot of stability to the joint once it's cut. So it'll be a 1/2 inch wide, and it'll start here at 1/2 inch from the end of the board, and so it's also going to stop a 1/2 inch before the end of this board, and so it'll be set up like that. So in total, this mortise will be a 1/2 inch wide and 3 inches long. I marked out lines here a 1/4 inch from the ends because the doweling jig has lines down inside that indicate the center line of the drill bit that'll be put through the hole here. So we'll be using the 1/2 inch hole that's in the doweling jig, and so I'll be watching for that little white line that's down inside there to be lined up with the extra marks that I have here and here. Okay, so now I'm lining up where I need to drill the hole. The neat thing about this doweling jig is that as I turn the crank, it automatically centers the hole in the width of the board. So I don't have to really worry too much about manually centering it. I just need to watch for the little line that indicates the center line of the hole and get that lined up with that additional pencil mark that I made on the board. Okay, so now I've got that set. I want the tenon to be 3/4 of an inch long, and because this drill bit has kind of a bevel at the bottom of it, I actually need to make the hole deeper than 3/4 of an inch. And so what I'll do is I'll put the drill bit on there like that, and now I need to figure out how deep I'll be able to cut. So I think what I'll do is I'll have it go in 1 inch, and that way there's room also down in the bottom for the glue to go. So I'll use some blue tape, and I'll create a flag on the drill bit at 1 inch so that I know when to stop drilling. Just verify that I've got 1 inch. Okay, I actually went a little bit deeper than 1 inch, so I'll stop before this blue tape gets all the way down to the surface here. Okay, so now the first hole is drilled. Okay, so we'll move over a 1/2 inch at a time, because it doesn't seem like this jig likes to move over 1/4 inch at a time. It might work using a brad point drill bit, but not this push drill bit, to step over a 1/4 inch each time. Okay, and you want to make sure that you're paying attention when you're drilling these out. Don't just get excited and go over, because you could end up making a mistake and going too far. As I did here, I actually drilled out 2 more holes than what I needed instead of stopping when I should have. I was getting in too much of a pattern of drilling, but we can work with this. We'll try to patch in these holes later on once we get the mortise created. Okay, so now we need to chisel that out. I'll bring it over so that you can see what I've done here. I essentially went a 1/2 inch too far. With a mortise, and because we created the mortise a 1/2 inch in from the end of the board, this actually may get covered up, and so we may not need to worry about that too much, but we'll try to plug it later on. So here's the mortise. It started in exactly the right spot, and now we've got to clean up the mortise here using a chisel. Okay, so now I need to get the chisel ready. I have a 1/2 inch chisel set to go, and what I'm going to do is try to square up this end just by pushing it in. The oak may give a little bit too much resistance, but I'm going to try pushing it in maybe a 1/16 of an inch from where I've got the line drawn for the end of the mortise. And then once we get that removed, I'll come back and clean it up closer to where the end should be. And I don't want to wedge too much using this chisel because I could end up bending it. So I want to be a little bit careful about that. Okay, so I've got this one end squared up. Now I can go down to the other end where I overshot it. And I'm going to try to square that up. Okay, so we're moving along here. I'm going to pull this board off the table and move it to the other end of the workbench so that it's easier for you to see what I'm doing when I'm cleaning out the inside of this mortise. Now that I have the mortise over here closer to where the camera is at, what I'll do is I'll switch over to using the widest chisel that I have to try to get a straight edge going across here for the mortise. And I'll just try to use hand pressure at first. And if I need more than that pressure, then I'll bring out the mallet and strike it. But since I'm going with the grain here, it should be fairly easy as long as your chisel is sharp. Okay, so I need to wedge some of that wood chips out of there. Well, this feels like 9th grade woodworking class again here, where I'm creating mortise and tenon joints using chisels and doweling jigs. There's so many different ways to create these mortise and tenon joints that I think you'll be surprised in the upcoming videos how many different ways you can have to create mortise and tenon joints. And in some cases you can create them very, very quickly. In other cases it takes quite a bit of work to get things set up right. And then to clean up the results. Okay, so there's just a little bit more here to straighten out. And then we can head over to the table saw to create the matching tenon. Okay. Okay, so there's the tenon cleaned out. It looks like I've got just a little bit more work to do right in through here, and then it'll be all set. And so I'll take care of that real quick. Here's the cleaned up mortise, and what I've done here is I've squared up the end where I overshot the end of the mortise, and I created a little plug that's a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. That should just fit right down inside, and I'll try to grain match that and glue it in place, and then it will never be obvious that I overshot the end of the mortise. This will all be hidden by the tenon anyway, so that's okay. Or at least it should be hidden by the tenon. So we're going to head over to the table saw now. Yeah, I'm at the table saw now. I've installed the patch into the board here where I overshot the length of the mortise. The glue is still setting up in there, but it should be set pretty soon. I've got just a cheap miter gauge here. This is one that came with the saw originally. And what I've done here is I've installed an oak fence on it. It's just screwed into it using the 2 screw holes that are in the back of the miter fence. I've attempted to set the height of the saw blade, which is a combination blade, to 1/8 of an inch. And what you've got to watch out for is that these teeth are kind of beveled. So in other words, it'll create a cut that has sharp points on each side. So it'll be kind of like a V groove into the board we're going to be cutting into. If we had a little bit more of a budget, we could get a saw blade that looks like this. This is a 40 tooth blade, and this has flat ground teeth on it, just like a rip blade, except that this has quite a few more teeth. And so this would leave a flat bottom cut, whereas a standard combination blade will leave kind of a rough cut that we'll have to straighten out using a chisel. Okay, so I've got the blade set to roughly 1/8 of an inch. I've got to watch out. This saw has a tendency to have the height of the blade creep up, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. I have made a single cut through here using the saw blade to establish the point where that comes through the fence, and then I made a mark 3/4 of an inch over using the ruler, and then I set this stop block in that location so that the tenons that we're cutting will be 3/4 of an inch wide. Okay, so here's the board we're going to be using for the tenon. So what I'd like to do first is to verify that I have the height set correctly. And probably the best way to do that is just to take a cut on the end here, flip it over, and then make another cut on the end, and then we can measure it and see if we're getting to a 1/2 inch. So let's see how thick it is right here now. I've got this up here so that we can see it. And that is a little bit over a ½ inch. That's about 5/8 right now. So I need to bring that blade up ever so slightly more, and then we'll make the cut again. And I have to watch that this blade does not drift. As I said earlier, it tends to drift in height on this saw because the height lock is bound up on it. Now. And still needs to come up a little bit. Now it says that I overshot it a little bit. Back it down a little more. Make another cut. Ever so slightly too much. Because I want to use a chisel to get this to be completely flat. I need to drop the blade down ever so slightly more. Right now, the roll points created by the edge of the saw blade are right at a ½ inch. we'll just go with that. It's still up ever so slightly. Okay, so here's what we have so far. As you can see, the cut left behind by that combination blade is a bit rough. We'll want to straighten that out using a chisel as much as possible so that we've got a nice looking surface so that the glue will adhere nicely to it. Okay, so now we need to cut the section here down a 1/2 inch. And also on this end. Okay, that should be in the right ballpark. We'll do a test cut and then measure it. That'll work. Okay, so our tenon is cut. We still need to clean it up so that it's not so rough, so that it has a nicer glue surface. And once we do that, it looks like we're going to have a nice fit into the joint. Now I need to take just a light pass across the grain. Just take down the high spots. Okay, so let's try a test fit. Now I've got the high spots knocked down. Okay, so that looks like that joint went together nicely, and it's flush at the top, and at the bottom here you cannot see where I put in the patch to hide the fact that I cut the mortise longer than what it should have been. So now this joint is ready to be glued up. Okay, so now we're ready to head over to the PantoRouter and repeat creating this joint using that device, and we'll see whether or not that device is any quicker than the method that we used here using chisels and the doweling jig and the table saw. Okay, we're at the PantoRouter here. I have set the fence to 2 inches off the center line on the table, and 2 inches of course is half of 4 inches, which is the width of this board. And so I'll get started by cutting the mortise. I have a 1/2 inch diameter spiral cutter bit mounted into the router right now. I have a 3-inch template up here on the template holder, and it is centered side to side using the back end of the fowler. So now I'll put the fowler in the correct location. Okay, now I need to set the height. I want the mortise to be centered vertically on this board, so what I can do is I can just use the board as a template just by setting it on the ledge back here. Tighten down the clamps, and now that's set. Now what I can do is I can clamp this board onto the table, and then we should be ready to get started cutting the mortises. Okay, so I have the clamps on the table now. I need to secure them in place. Okay, now I need to move this stop out of the way. Okay, and so we'll be moving inward and then across, just like that, to make the cut. And now I need to set the depth of cut. I want the depth of cut to be just over 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to use a 3/4 inch setup block right here to set the depth of cut by positioning the front stop. So I want it to be just over 3/4 of an inch. Okay, that's been set. And now we're ready to cut the mortise. I will not be using dust collection here so that you're able to see the cutting action. But normally you would have dust collection hooked up to this to limit the amount of chips that fly all around the shop. Okay, so the mortise has been cut, and as you can see there, what I did was I went in, and as I swept across, I pushed the handle toward the right to move the bit in ever so slightly as I was going across. And then once I got to the other end, then I did the same thing going in the opposite direction to eventually get down to the just over 3/4 of an inch depth of cut. So now let's see if we can show what this looks like. Okay, that's a nice clean mortise, and of course it has rounded corners, so the tenon that we create will also have to have rounded corners, and that'll be easy to do. I need to get a different style clamp. need to do is I need to set the PantoRouter up to work with a 3/4 inch thick stock. So I've taken the board that'll be used to cut the tenon into, and I put it onto the ledge back here. Okay, and I just drop down until the template holder is resting on top of the board. And now I can take that board and clamp it onto the table so that at least 3/4 inch is extending beyond the end of the table. Probably want to make it at least an inch. And then I can clamp that board onto the table. Now I need to switch out the guide bearing for a 22mm guide bearing, which is the largest one that's supplied with a kit. Okay, and there's 3 little lines here on top of the template, and I found that if I put the bearing so that it rests just to the right of center of this second line, then it'll achieve a 1/2 inch thick tenon down here or thereabout. I may need to do it a couple times to get the exact dimension. Okay, so now we need to make sure that we've got the depth of cut set to 3/4 inch. And so we'll bring the bit in so that it makes contact. And then I need to set the front stop so that we're 3/4 inch. Okay, so now that's at 3/4 inch. So now we're ready to get it started. Okay, so let's see if it fits. And that is a very tight fit. And it looks like it is going together. Okay, so I'm going to take this off the PantoRouter table and we'll put it together. So here's the cut tenon, and of course there's the mortise. So now we'll try to put it together. And I'll have to use a mallet off on the workbench here. Okay, so there's the assembled joint. I'll have to bring that in a little bit when I clamp it. It is a very tight joint, and if I wanted to make it a little bit looser, that's very easy to do on the PantoRouter here. Of course, I've already removed it from the table, but if I need to make it looser fit, then what I can do is I can take this bearing and then slide it ever so slightly further away from the template holder. Not much, maybe a 1/64 of an inch, and that would have made it so that the joint was not quite so tight, and it would have just slid together, and of course the glue will then hold it in place. As it is right now, it's a very tight joint, and I like tight joints, and here you can see that it's flush on the top, and there's no imperfections here on the bottom where it was cut too long. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.